Muy buenos días, buenas tardes a todos y todas.
Good morning and good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Remember, you can choose simultaneous interpreting so you can listen to the language of your choice.
The bottom of the screen, so we can all understand the different speakers that we have today. Mi nombre es Piedad Martín, soy la directora regional adjunta al
My
programa.
name is Piedad Martín. I'm the Deputy Regional Director and Officer in Charge in UNEP Latin America and the Caribbean. It's an honor to be with you for the official launching of the working group on taxonomies of sustainable finance in Latin America and the Caribbean. Because there are no taxonomies right now, there is an opportunity of defining what is a sustainable investment with a participatory process and build this common language that will allow us to mobilize in an aligned, orderly, and congruent way with climate objectives, investment of capitals to comply with the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. This group has been created as part of the Interagency Technical Committee of the Environment Fund of Ministers in Latin America and the Caribbean, and this committee is made up by UNEP, the Economic Commission for Latin America, the World Bank Group, the UNDP, the IDP, the Latin American Development Bank, CAF, and the United Nations for Food and Agriculture, plus the financial aid of Euroclimate. So many actors are confluencing to make us advance in this regional initiative. Thank you very much to those connected in YouTube. This session is being transmitted through the platform in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. This meeting will have 4 panels where different specialists will talk about the common foundation, the challenges, the work plan in the region to develop this taxonomy framework, and some best practices at international level. We want to send special meetings to Minister Franz back from Costa Rica, who is right now the chair of the Forum of Ministers and the Environment of Latin America and the Caribbean, and who hasn't been able to come due to last-minute issues. You know, it's a new cabinet, and he had the intention to attend that because of his designation. We have Tapia, who is the General Director of the Ministry of Environment of Costa Rica. Also, I'd like to welcome Erica, who is the head of UNEP 5, Global Association between UNEP and the financial sector to mobilize the financial sector towards sustainable development. With no more to say, I pass the floor to Enid and then to Eric. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Piedad. Good morning to all the participants of this event. On behalf of the Ministry of Environment and Energy of Costa Rica, Mr. Franz Tettenbeck, allow me to greet him for him and apologize for him for not being here. It's an honor to share this opening session with Mr. Eric Hescher and Ms. Piedad Martin, who are unique allies of the Forum of Ministers of the Environment of Latin America and the Caribbean and our government. These last 2 years have been very difficult for countries marked by COVID-19 and the current food crisis. Our economies have suffered a strong impact together to the climate crisis. The crisis is very present and is having devastating effects all over the world, with an important impact in Latin America and the Caribbean. In February 2021, during the 22nd meeting of the Forum of Ministers of the Environment of Latin America and the Caribbean, we adopted the Bridgetown Declaration that acknowledges that countries have to integrate responses aligned with the climate and their recovery plans after COVID-19, allowing for the creation of decent employment in line with development priorities defined by countries and sustainable development objectives. goals. Particularly, ministers emphasize the need of promoting synergies with financial entities to develop innovative financial mechanisms, promoting financial flow towards climate action. Access to financing is a backbone in recovery plans. In this context, the vision of this region is to strengthen the environment and the social dimensions in the real economy, aiding the productive sectors in their transition to create jobs and develop resilient infrastructure projects so as to comply with the Paris Agreement and the 2030 agenda. This is a cornerstone for allocating public resources in our post-COVID economic recovery plans. To date, these countries have only allocated $5.2 billion to environmentally sustainable measures. It is only 1.2% of total expenditure, or 1.8% expenditure in recovery. To ensure our way towards the Paris Agreement objectives and the 2030 agenda, and improve the long-term development in the region, the Forum of Ministers expressed a petition to different financing mechanisms, cooperation programs, partners, and countries, so they provide financial support and facilitate the Bridgestone Declaration. The Forum acknowledges the catalyzing role of the private sector, particularly the financial industry, so as to close the financial gap towards transition and energy transition and climate economy in all of our region. Our countries that formulate environmental policies have to show investment opportunities and reorient financial flows towards compliance with the Paris Agreement and the 2030 agenda. According to Mr. Tettenbach, to reach this inclusive and environmental transition, we need to talk the same language when we refer to sustainable financing. We support public policy formulators, so banks, investors, financial regulators, and international organization specialists to build a common language and a definition based on science to define what is sustainable financing and what is not. Our countries are more and more trying to develop clear definitions of economic activities and investments that incorporate their own national environmental objectives. Therefore, it is necessary to promote dialogue, learn from the experiences of our governments, and align the sustainable finance market in our region. A set of comparable and interoperable definitions among our jurisdictions would contribute credibility, integrity, and transparency to the market, facilitating the investment opportunities for the private sector, those who participate in the financial industry particularly, and mobilize capitals related to the Paris Agreement objectives and the 2030 agenda. The process to establish a regional framework that is common for sustainable finance taxonomy needs to take into account local specificities and be based on science. So from the chair of the Forum of Ministers of the Environment of Latin America and the Caribbean, we are honored to officially launch today, June 7th at 8:17 Costa Rica time, the Working Group on Finance, Sustainable Finance Taxonomy for Latin America and the Caribbean, an initiative which is part of the technical committee of the Interagency Group of the Forum of Ministers that joins sustainable financing experts to create the sustainable finance framework for Latin America and the Caribbean, together with the UNAP, the Economic Commission for Latin America, the UNDP, the World Bank Group, the IDB, the Bank for Latin American Development, CAD, FAO, and the International Monetary Fund. We call the Ministries of Finance, financial regulators and supervisors, development banks, public and private investors, international organizations, and the academia to support the this working group of taxonomy to provide appropriate signals to investors and harness the green potential of investments in the region, low in emissions and resilient. Thank you. I'd like to thank UNEP for their work and the European Commission, the Euroclimate Plus, for making this launching possible. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Enid. And now we have Eric.
Thank you very much, Enid.
Go ahead, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Didad, and thank you, Enid. And my best regards to Minister Tattenbach, and certainly understanding his pressing everything that's going on today that has to be dealing with. I was actually this past Friday co-chairing a session at the Stockholm Plus 50 conference with your former minister, Carlos Rodriguez, in his new role as CEO of the Global Environment Facility, the GEF. Now, it's a real great pleasure to be speaking to you all today at the official launch of the Working Group on Sustainable Finance Taxonomies in Latin America and Caribbean region. Really important initiative for the financial market in the region. You know, it's clear that the global financial markets have the real potential to bridge the sustainability gap by linking financing needs to global sources of funding. For instance, analysts projected that around $4 trillion US needs to be invested annually just decarbonizing the global economy. Having our roots in the Rio Earth Summit 1992, UNEP-FI is a global partnership between the UN and 460 some banks, insurers, investors, plus 100 supporting institutions like banking associations. We've been working for 30 years nearly to help financial institutions integrate sustainability considerations into financial practice. The Latin American Caribbean region for us is the second largest for us globally in terms of signatories after Europe. We have 42 signatory banks to the Principles for Responsible Banking in the region, who together account for more than 70% of assets under management of the region. We also have 19 insurance companies who are signatories to Principles Sustainable Insurance that we also oversee. And we have 12 stock exchanges who are part of the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative. Now, at UNEP-FI, we really believe that voluntary action from the financial industry is not a replacement for regulatory action, but rather often an expected precursor or core ingredient to it. You know, this relationship between public and private, it's less of a step function, you know, where financiers wait for regulations, and more of a sort of a dance whereby each party makes a move that then signals the other to respond. You know, through this, we're building trust and the ratcheting of ambition that the Paris Agreement was designed to foster. Now, at this stage, as has been already mentioned, there are many private initiatives for understanding and defining what are sustainable green or climate investments. We've heard so many definitions over the years, yet the signal to the market from the financial regulators has not really been clear enough yet about future economic trends, the forward-looking investment opportunities and risks that the new climate scenarios are bringing. So to mobilize private capital at scale, we really need a compatible language on what is environmentally sustainable, where the thresholds are, and what clearly is not sustainable. This information asymmetry and fragmentation of approaches are among the main current barriers to be overcome for increasing market uptake on sustainable finance. Addressing these barriers I think is particularly relevant for the growth emerging markets because it seeks to further integrate financial markets from a regional perspective and with other international markets, avoiding any overlaps or transaction costs. So, a comparable and interoperable set of definitions in and among jurisdictions can really help bring credibility, bring integrity and transparency to the market, and facilitate the identification of investment opportunities for the financial market participants. And through this, in turn, enabling the mobilization of capital linked to the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN's wider 2030 agenda. Now, thereafter, after listening to Enid, excuse me, providing the ministerial perspective, I want to applaud the initiative of the Forum of Environment Ministers of Latin America and the Caribbean to work hand in hand with financial actors to support the identification of sustainable investment opportunities. This is going to foster the certainty, the credibility, the integrity, and transparency to the market, and in turn enable the mobilization of capital aligned to each country's environmental goals. Now, I'm convinced that the working group on sustainable finance taxonomies in Latin America and the Caribbean, the GTT LAC, it's a super collaborative mechanism for financial actors to help ratchet ESG ambitions to a new level of activity, comparability, and credibility. With this, we hope that the private finance community can really credibly lean in to the climate challenges and also, of course, the business opportunities. So our aim here is to help financial actors voluntarily provide leadership, which helps position for sustainability transitions, but also helps catalyze governments to join this dance and create the conditions where laggards have no choice but to also join the fray. Public and private action, both credible and ambitious, this is what the world needs today. A few years ago, we saw the EU platform on sustainable finance, who helped enhance the standardization within the European market on what clear definitions are around economic activities. Today, it's the GTT LAC who is to take the turn. And I really want to encourage the regional financial institutions listening today, please to pay special attention to the outcomes from this GTT LAC and join this collaborative mechanism. It's indeed, I think, important that the GTT LAC outcomes can facilitate the sustainable investment dialogue that we need. Lastly, but not least, my best wishes for the excellent session today, bringing together representatives from financial regulators, from ministries of environment, ministries of finance, superintendencies, the securities market, the stock exchanges, and experts from the IPFS, the European Commission, and the Climate Bonds Initiative. With that, thank you, and let's get started.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much for your words. Vamos a continuar con el primer panel de este encuentro.
We're now going to continue with the first panel of this meeting, Global and Regional Landscape on Sustainable Finance. We will have Charlotte Gardens-Landolfini, climate change, energy, and financial stability expert of the IMF. She will moderate the conversation between Sylvia Anna Ainu, Policy Officer on Sustainable Finance at the General Directorate for International Partnerships at the European Commission, Graham Watkins, Chief Climate Change Division IDB, and Farah Hussain, Senior Financial Officer, World Bank Treasury. Welcome. Go ahead with this first panel. Thank you very much, Piedad. I'm very proud of being able to moderate this panel today. I'll speak in English to introduce our participants.
Moderate this panel today. I hope you can all hear me. I'm going to present quickly. Piedad did already, but maybe the three speakers, excellent speakers that I have the pleasure to moderate today on the global and regional landscape for taxonomies. So first, Sylvia Ainu. So Sylvia, you're policy officer at the European Commission, and you focus on innovative financing instruments for climate action. Graham Watkins, Chief of the Climate Change Division in the IDB. You lead the bank's efforts to support climate policy and planning in Latin America and the Caribbean governments, increasing the availability of financing to drive climate transformation, integrate climate into banking operations, and promote knowledge on sustainable infrastructure, climate risk, and decarbonization. And Farah Hussain, you're Senior Financial Officer in the World Bank Treasury, where you lead the sustainable finance business line, facilitating the issuance of sustainable bonds and working with regulators to promote the development of sustainable capital markets, including taxonomies. And you have led the World Bank's engagement of sovereign sustainable bonds in various countries, and including Colombia, as far as the South American continent is concerned. So obviously, and I think the speakers that have taken the floor today already have been very clear on the role of taxonomies globally and regionally for capital allocation purposes, for sharing the same language as it comes to the financing of the energy and ecological transition, and also for other purposes. And so this panel will focus first on the current trends in the region and how the different organizations that are represented today are contributing to the development of these taxonomies and how they think they are useful. And the second part of the panel will focus more on the challenges that are associated with the implementation of these taxonomies and the use by financial market participants. So, without further ado, we can turn maybe to the first part of the panel on the current trends and experience. I can leave the floor to the World Bank Group, to Farah, asking to what extent the World Bank has been working with emerging market regulators on developing sustainable capital markets, and what are the main trends that you are seeing in these emerging markets and developing economies? If you want to take the floor.
Sure. Thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you for that kind introduction. And let me also thank the host for inviting me to participate in this very important discussion. Obviously, I'm a financial specialist. I work for the World Bank Treasury, and this is an incredibly exciting time to work in the financial sector because of the way it is now invested in managing climate-related and other sustainability risks, and how all of that is changing businesses, moving markets, and driving regulations. And we are very, very excited to be able to contribute towards that. The World Bank Group has been promoting sustainable finance, working on sustainable finance for many years, including through our own funding program. As I mentioned, I work for the World Bank Treasury, specifically in our capital markets and investment department. And my team works with emerging markets to develop sustainable financial systems. So as you said, we work with financial regulators to help them develop regulations and guidelines and incentives to green the financial system and make it more sustainable. And a large part of our work is in providing technical assistance to facilitate the issuance of what we call sustainable bonds or thematic bonds or ESG bonds, the green, the social, the sustainable, etc. But we also work with regulators, and the way that I like to say it is that we help them create the ecosystems in which emerging markets can actually benefit from the financial sector's interest in managing ESG risks and, of course, achieving environmental and social impact. So that involves, of course, helping our clients develop green taxonomies and all of these regulations that I was talking about. So you asked specifically about the trends that we are seeing. Obviously, we are all aware of what I like to call the tsunami of sustainability-related regulations that is coming our way and coming the way of our clients. Of course, I'm talking about the International Sustainability Standards Board framework for reporting about climate and other sustainability-related risks. We have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. We have the EU Taxonomy. We have the proposed EU Green Bond Standards, which are going to be stricter in defining what is green than existing market guidelines. All of them, of course, very well intentioned. But of course, all of this also has, implications for our clients, for emerging markets, where we all know, there's a lack of data, a lack of capacity. And, as we all know that, the climate plans, the pathways to achieve the 1.5 degree scenario are different for many of our client countries. So we are, and they are certainly concerned about, the implications of capital flowing from the global markets into the emerging markets. So a large part of our work is actually about working with them to build their capacity to understand these regulations. But we are also seeing that the emerging markets are taking the initiative to develop their own regulations, their own guidelines and taxonomies. As you know, a growing number of countries are implementing climate-related disclosure requirements. They're issuing taxonomies. In Latin America, of course, Brazil's central bank has made it mandatory for banks to incorporate climate change-related risks in their stress tests. They're asking banks to disclose climate-related information as part of financial reporting, and this is all going to happen by this year, in fact, by July 2022. And we also know other central banks are doing very similar work. For instance, the Central Bank of Malaysia, Bank Negara Malaysia, has also announced their plans for mandatory climate-related disclosures, climate stress test. They have developed guidance for financial institutions on impact-based governance, what they call value-based intermediation. They've also issued a green taxonomy. Bangladesh has done a lot of work in this area on reporting and disclosure. They're also working on a green taxonomy, which shows that it's not just the sort of upper middle income countries, but the lower middle income countries and the low income countries are also not lagging behind in this area. Of course, in Mexico as well, the Central Bank and Securities Council are asking financial institutions as well as non-financial institutions to report on how they plan to take into consideration ESG factors in decision making. And also and that's why I mentioned that tsunami of regulations that is coming everybody's way, and all with the best intentions in mind. In the last couple of months, we've seen a number of green taxonomies being launched. Colombia, which we were very happy to work with Colombia, the Securities Commission and the Ministries of Finance to help them develop their green taxonomy, as well as Indonesia and South Africa. They all released their green taxonomies. And we know that a number of countries, both in Latin America as well as in other regions, are already, either in the process of developing the taxonomies or doing some preliminary work on them. And then in the global bond issuances, in the share of emerging market green social bonds, they have risen. Now we're seeing, especially, if you compare the issuance of emerging market GSS bonds between 2021 and 2022, it's already up by 22% compared to the same period in 2021. And even if you compare the number of emerging market sovereign issuers compared to developed market sovereign issuers, we have 17 sovereign issuers from emerging markets who have issued these bonds compared to 22 issuers in advanced markets. So obviously this is a very, very exciting time for the financial sector, and we are very, very happy to support them in the work that they are doing in this space. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Farah. Thank you. It was a very broad overview of what's happening. So that's very, very useful. So maybe if we turn to our next panelist, to Graham Watkins, on the role of the Inter-American Development Bank. How do you see the IDB? How does the IDB, I should say, see green taxonomies in the broader climate and sustainability agenda of the region, so of South and Latin America? Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Many thanks for the opportunity to be able to speak. In a nutshell, I would say green taxonomies are absolutely crucial for redirecting both public and private finance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think that's in essence the message that Enid and Eric and Farah have basically been saying so far. I do think that they need to address the specific needs of different countries, and there is a huge variability from country to country in terms of what's needed, but need to be sufficiently standardized to be able to guide and provide consistency for the investors. So there's a bit of a tension there that needs to be addressed. it is key in terms of delivering what we need for a Paris Agreement and for sustainable development. But I wanted to focus in on three issues. One is the scale that we're talking about. I think Farah talked a little bit about that. The other is the transversality of the impact of the changes that we need to see, and then finally, what can be the role of green taxonomies in that. I mean, I was in a talk the other day with Mark Carney and John Kerry, where they pointed out that in fact what we're facing here, that you could call a sustainability revolution, and it is a bit like the industrial revolution. That is the scale we're talking about. It's not small. This is huge. This is the biggest thing we've ever seen. So we need to begin thinking that way. It's as far as tsunami, as it were, but it is a huge tsunami. It's not a small tsunami. We calculated for LAC alone, you're talking about changes of about 470 billion to 1.3 trillion annually that need to be redirected. That's a huge amount, both public and private finance. So let's be clear on that. And let's also be clear on the role of banks like ours. I mean, we deliver 6 billion of climate finance every year, but 6 billion compared to 500 billion or even to 1.3 trillion is a drop in the bucket. So we need to be really strategic about how we use our money to align the Paris Agreement, make sure it's all aligned to the Paris Agreement, and also make sure that it's showing the way forward, it's leading the way forward. There's clearly money out there, and there's a growing amount of money out there that can be aligned with this agenda. That the investor commitments to net zero, to sustainability, to the SDGs, those are all coming online. This ESG investing, it's there, but it needs to be accessed, and that's a bit of the challenge. And the countries need to create basically the policy and regulatory environments that allow that investment to come in. So you can change, I repeat, both public spending and channeling of private spending. So that's the scale. Transversality. When Mark Carney and John Kerry talk about this revolution, we're not just talking about the traditional sectors that we focused on for the last 20 years. We're not just talking about the energy sector. We're not just talking about transport. We're not just talking about land use. We're talking about everything. Everything has to change. The supporting sectors, the policy environments, the context in which we work, health systems have to change. The whole thing has to change. And I think that's kind of key when you start doing taxonomies. You need to start asking questions, okay, well, what are the changes and adaptation that we need to see in social protection, for example? Those two are investments that need to be encouraged and move forward. And this goes well beyond, green buildings. I mean, the range of contexts in which you need to move is huge. And that makes it quite a complex challenge when you think about it on the ground in a particular country. What do I need to actually change? So, I mean, just as a random example of that, sustainable mining. You're going to need mining to be able to deliver the minerals that are required for the revolution, either export or in the home country. So what is sustainable mining, and how do you define it, and how do you set it up, and how do you... So there are complex questions that need to be addressed across all sectors. And I also want to really emphasize this question of you need to change the institutional arrangements and the social systems so that you can actually make them more resilient to shocks in the future, but also guide things like just transition to make sure that that's happening in the right way. So the transversality is tricky, complex, and it's going to be part of those discussions on what is a green taxonomy. And then finally, that on the green taxonomies themselves, and I keep emphasizing the message, not only can they guide private finance, but they can guide public finance. One of the areas that we're working on quite a lot is the question of budget tagging. Are investments actually positive or negative for sustainability? Right now, frankly, they're pretty negative. We've done 4 countries, I think, looking at LAC, and we found that most of the subsidies are still there. Subsidies get repeated. Those things need to be looked at. They need to be changed. And at the same time, you need the positive reinforcement of sustainability investing from the public side. So the other question that I think is that we need to be able to, as I think Farah emphasized quite substantially, is that to take advantage and create not new instruments that are already existing, things like green bonds, sovereign green bonds, to actually move the agendas forward and really channel the financing. We're getting increasing demand for rethinking instruments, even old instruments like debt for nature swaps, and how you can retask those to actually be able to deliver on the ends that we're trying to look at the moment. And then finally, we need to make sure, and this is a key message, that we need to make sure that we're trying to reduce the transactional costs for the investors. We're trying to make sure things are as simple as possible, as clear as possible across the whole system to be able to move the agenda forward. So I'll stop there because I know we're a bit short on time, but thank you very much, Charlotte.
No, thank you, Graham. It's wonderful to hear you about that and to give these three main trends, which are absolutely key. So thank you for that. Maybe if we turn to Sylvia on behalf of the European Commission, we've talked a lot about the EU taxonomy, about its role globally, and about the input that the European Union has made at the global scale. So maybe what is the European Commission currently doing and planning also in order to support sustainable finance, not only in Europe, but in emerging markets also? Would love to hear you about that, Sylvia.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you very much for having me today. I'm very pleased to be able to intervene in this very important, relevant discussion. I would like to start maybe by explaining why in the EU we believe that sustainable finance is crucial to help channel finance where it's most needed. I mean, most of it has already been mentioned actually by Graham and Farah, and indeed we all are aware of the fact that trillions of euros are needed every year to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but also broadly the social objectives of the SDGs. But I think what is, let's say, a European perspective that adds to what has already been said is the fact that we have been thinking that well, on the one hand, we're the largest ODA provider, but we do also, and we're very much aware that public finance alone is not going to actually give a scale that is needed to actually bridge the SDG financing gap. So as the largest ODA provider, we've been asking ourselves a lot, like how do we actually mobilize these trillions of financial assets that are managed globally by banks, by asset managers, by institutional investors? And how do we do that specifically for low and middle income countries? Within Europe, there are apparently 4 trillion of funds that are now branded as sustainable. Now, the question is, how do we actually make sure that these sustainability branding and the investments are going in the right way? Especially, when, as Graham mentioned, the range of contexts in which you need to move is really huge. And sustainable finance is indeed a strong asset to basically steer capital flows into environmentally sustainable activities. But of course, it's also at risk of greenwashing. And at the beginning of the discussion today, Eric Asher mentioned the issue with fragmenting approaches to defining green. Within the EU, we've done that. We've done the first step. There's still quite a lot to do. It was one of the key concerns we had. Basically, within the EU landscape, we've taken different steps to move towards a sustainable finance framework. And at the core of it is the EU taxonomy, of course, and then it's the disclosure requirements that we put in place for both financial and also non-financial undertakings. Now, you ask what we're currently doing. We have a DG, which is the one where I'm representing, that is specifically tailored for low and middle income countries that are our partner countries that we work with. And inside here, we've been thinking a lot basically around what can we do in order for, let's say, the different lessons learned from the policymaking within the EU to be useful for our partner countries. Now, we're already supporting sustainable investments in our partner countries by sharing the risk with investors and with private lenders with our financial guarantees that are basically a 40 billion European fund for sustainable development, and that de-risks private investments. And this is one of the starting points that we're considering right now. How do we tailor the de-risking to sustainability investments? And we make sure that this is one of the building blocks basically to make sure that sustainable finance flows in the right ways. We're also providing TA to our partner countries, so technical assistance. Technical assistance is key, and we're doing that with our European delegations that are all across the world, and precisely, of course, also in Latin America, to support the creation of a sustainable project pipeline and conducive programs. And now, what are we doing? We're creating basically a little bit of alignment to navigate the tsunami of different sustainable finance definitions, innovations, and taxonomies around the world. We are going to basically create a new strategy that comes from original reflection upon the importance that low and middle income countries play for financing the transition towards a sustainable economy. And we are setting up right now basically a strategy to support low and middle income countries in scaling up their access to sustainable finance and promote sustainable related financial instruments. To do so, as we often do in the Commission, we're setting up a high-level group on scaling up sustainable finance to identify the different challenges and the opportunities that sustainable finance presents in low and middle income countries. And then this group is supposed to provide recommendations to the Commission to create this strategy that is aiming to accelerate private financial flows, European flows, but also, to use our instruments to mobilize local markets basically with the aim of implementing the external dimension of the Green Deal from a European perspective, and then of course also to promote a green, just and resilient recovery in partner countries. We see a lot of overlaps of our high-level group that we're just in the process to launch, with of course the LAC Working Group on Sustainable Finance. Indeed, what we're going to create is a strategy that is specifically for low and middle income countries, and we want to come up with a theory of how the EU can be conducive for different regions, and specifically of course also the Latin American region, to develop. The strategy itself will feed in the work of the EU for the all years to come, and the support that we will provide to partner countries, such as all the Latin American countries that we work with. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. This is super interesting, obviously, and I see lots of connections with many work streams globally that we could talk about during the Latin America and Caribbean Working Group on taxonomies. Maybe because I see we're a bit behind on schedule, if we can go to the second part of the panel quickly on the challenges, because I think those are important to raise, especially before the next panels come in. Maybe starting with the IDB, Graham, I was wondering to what extent you've got examples of the implementation of these green taxonomies in the region from which we can learn. If you can provide just a couple of them, that would be very helpful, so that Farah and Sylvia also can give their feedback on the experience with the implementation of taxonomies. Thank you.
Okay, great, and thanks. I think Eric mentioned countries or places that may be laggards, and I think it's better to perhaps focus on the vanguards, the countries that are actually moving in the right direction, and those are the ones that are giving examples to others. And I think actually for the region, we're quite lucky that there are several countries that are moving in the right direction and moving quite rapidly in the right direction. In Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Peru, Mexico, Brazil even, who are moving with ESG investing quite rapidly, and even the Dominican Republic is starting to move on green taxonomies and things like that, amongst others. So a lot of these countries are already, and I think this was already mentioned, beginning to put in place their long-term strategies, thinking long-term, not just about mitigation, but also thinking about adaptation, and then driving that down through the NDCs, through investment plans, through financial planning, through consideration of fiscal impacts to actually get to the actual projects that we need to see at the end of the day. So I think that there are leaders that can actually share information amongst countries and that can be very, very useful in terms of avoiding reinventing the wheel. So every country doesn't have to go through the whole process again. They can learn from what other countries are doing. I think all countries will benefit from establishing green taxonomies over time. So very quickly, talk a bit more about the front-running countries, talk about Chile as an example, a little bit more detail, because it is one of the countries that's really moving in this agenda, and then talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities. So in the region, 11 countries have already made commitments to net zero. So 11 countries are already moving as quickly as they can in the right direction. 5 of those countries have long-term strategies, long-term transversal plans that actually take into consideration what you need to do with respect to mitigation, but also increasingly what you need to do with respect to adaptation and climate resilience. Those are the countries that are probably going to get access most quickly to the 15 million new net jobs that are going to appear through decarbonization in the region. We've also determined that a very rough analysis that you're probably going to see about 1% boost in GDP, in annual GDP in those countries. So you're starting to see benefits right off the bat if you start moving in this direction. And as well as that, you're also going to see increasing opportunities for private sector investment as we move forward. But beyond that, you're going to get cleaner cities, healthier people, competitive market access, and a whole bunch of other benefits are going to arrive as a result of being one of those front runners. The example of Chile is actually quite interesting, and I'm just going to give you, ramp it off a little bit like Farah was saying, bam, 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 there's a whole bunch of things happening. But they actually co-lead or have co-led the Coalition of Ministries of Finance for Climate Action with the World Bank. They do have a long-term strategy. They're updating the NDC. They just approved a climate law and they're just rolling that out right now. They already have public-private frameworks for delivering on green action. They have a roadmap for sustainable finance. They pioneered sovereign green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds. And I think about 25% of their bonds right now are in fact sustainability-linked or sustainability-connected. They've got green finance roundtables that are starting to work, which include multiple actors, including those market regulators and supervisors. And they're beginning to move towards a green taxonomy. So it's a lot going on in the country in terms of what's actually happening within the country. Now, their particular taxonomy is going to have to look at things like green hydrogen, coal phase out, resilient water systems in particular, which is a major area of interest and of importance in the country, questions of sustainable mining and nature-based solutions. So it's going to have to be housed in the context of that particular country. And at the same time, as we've a repeated message, we're going to have to make sure that it's coherent with the taxonomy, with the EU taxonomy, but also with that of Colombia, which has now come out. And I'm sure that Farah will talk a little bit more about what's happening in Colombia as another example of a country moving in that right direction. So what are the challenges and benefits? Well, obvious challenges, this is not easy, it's complicated. It takes a lot of effort to be able to move in the right direction and ensure sustainable investments. However, though, I think there's a willing coalition of support out there. I mean, all of the people that are in this meeting, the World Bank, Euroclimate, UN system, FAO, IMF, GIZ, CAF, the IDB, all of us, and I probably missed some names, are all trying to move in the same direction. And as long as we work together in the countries and actually collaborate in the countries, we can actually get this done. Because we can overcome some of those challenges. And I think Sylvia's comment on the need for technical assistance is crucial. We have to make that technical assistance available so that countries, if they want to move, can actually move as quickly as possible. I think challenges, keep it simple, stupid. I mean, these things can get overly complicated, and if they get overly complicated, they lose their market advantage. We need to make sure consistency.
I'm sorry, we need to close this panel and continue with the next one. I'm very, very sorry. Apologies for that.
My apologies too. Okay, well then I'll close right there. Sorry, Charlotte.
No, thank you, Graham, and thank you all for your wonderful, inputs. I think that relates really well to a lot of the global work we're doing, and actually we're collaborating with the World Bank and the BIS and the OECD on providing guidance on the implementation of these taxonomies against the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group high-level principles. So hopefully that will also help to bridge some of the challenges that Graham has talked about. But I'm sure we'll have many follow-up conversations with Farah and Sylvia also, and Graham obviously, and the rest of the group during this exciting project ahead. So thank you very much, and sorry for being a bit behind. I guess, it's so important and interesting that we didn't see time run. So sorry about that. I'll go to the next session then on sustainable finance taxonomies and the importance of enhancing the interoperability of taxonomies globally. And the moderator, which, for whom I leave the floor to, is Marcos Mancini. He's Senior Advisor at the UNDP Sustainable Finance Hub. So I'll leave you the floor, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, and what a great honor to be here today with everyone moderating this panel. We don't have much time, so I'm going to dive straight into it. This panel looks to discuss the importance of interoperability, as many panels have already mentioned, in the development of sustainable finance taxonomies. I have here with me today Maria Rafaela Zeta, who's the Deputy Head at the European Commission Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Services and Capital Markets Union. DG FISMA is the Commission department responsible for EU policy on banking and finance. We also have Marielle Martini, who's Taxonomy Outreach Manager at the Climate Bond Initiative. And joining us through a pre-recorded message, we have Majun, who is co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and co-chair of the IPSF Working Group on Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. My name is Marcos Mancini. I'm Senior Advisor for the United Nations Development Program Sustainable Finance Hub, and on a frequent basis, I get the chance to interact with many of the panelists here today as my team manages the day-to-day secretariat of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. What I like about this panel is that we cover global, regional, and national processes. Global through groups like the G20, the SFWG, the IPSF, which crowd in different perspectives from around the world and looking to discuss and promote this interoperability that we were referring to regionally with the taxonomy that DG FISMA needs to implement in the EU. Or in this case, what brings us here today at a LATAM basis. And at a country level, the work that CBI is doing in many jurisdictions, which also helps feed back again into this regional and global processes. In UNDP, we like to call this the elevator, how a global policy-making process gets operationalized into country and policy action. For example, in Argentina, a G20 country, we're working with the Ministry of Finance, helping develop a roadmap for the development of a taxonomy. In doing so, we're taking into consideration the implementation of the G20 Principles for taxonomies, for which the IPSF contributed to the G20 last year. In Chile, we are supporting the creation of national and subnational capacities to access high-quality financial data and information to step up the development of 2050 net zero financing strategies. So on and so forth. We see, as Graham was already pointing out, in Latin America, many cases that bring and try to operationalize these global and international policy-making processes and discussions in which many of us are taking place. As we are already seeing, this work is gaining traction in Latin America. So Rafaela, let me turn over to you and maybe have some reflections from your end on why is interoperability between taxonomies important, and what do you see in the context of the work that the IPSF is carrying forward.
Thank you, Marcos. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you hear me and see me well. Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me to take part in this panel, launching an important work on taxonomy. And I would like, before coming to your question, straight to your question, Marcos, to stress that, as Silvia mentioned already, sustainable finance has a key role to play in the transition to a climate neutral, climate resilient, resource efficient, and fair economy. Now, it has a role to play in the EU for the achievement of our policy objectives under the Green Deal and our international commitments. And in the EU, we are also very much aware that we operate in a global environment. Therefore, we welcome and we support actively ambitious international sustainable finance framework, since at the end of the day, climate change is a global concern, and capital markets are global as well. Now, in the EU, we are doing our part to facilitate the emergence of consensus. For example, through the, as you mentioned, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and the work of the International Platform on Sustainable Finance that we have the pleasure on for this. We have the pleasure to hold the secretariat. At the same time, of course, as it was mentioned very clearly in the previous panel, there are different starting points around the world, different transition trajectories, and different legal and policy constraints. So we acknowledge that in the short, medium term, objectives will not be realistically about international harmonization or convergence, but rather about enabling interoperability among various frameworks, and at the end of the day, about managing divergence. Now, the EU has been at the forefront of efforts to build a financial system that supports sustainable growth. And the EU taxonomy is one of the key pillars of these efforts. The EU taxonomy is intended to provide a robust, science-based classification system of economic activities, which allows non-financial and financial companies to share a common definition of sustainability. Now, therefore, we see this as very important, and we are very pleased to see that other jurisdictions around the world are looking at enacting their own taxonomies. It's true. Now, a lot of taxonomy have been developed around the world, And therefore, the question, at least what mentioned, there is a, a number of growing taxonomies being developed. The question of how they can be interoperable arises more and more. Coming to your question, why interoperability of taxonomy is important? It is important to avoid unnecessarily fragmented approaches, which would lead to increased transaction costs and insufficient cross-border capital flows. It is also important to help reduce inconsistencies between sustainable finance frameworks, because these inconsistencies may negatively impact companies which wish to engage in new green areas and more sustainable models. Lack of consistency will reduce comparability between sustainable projects and eventually lead to the greenwashing, which is one of the objectives the taxonomy aims at achieving, is avoid greenwashing. So this is why the interoperability is important. And this is also why one important exercise we have been doing in the International Platform on Sustainable Finance is important. I'm referring to the Common Ground Taxonomy, the so-called CGT, that the EU conducted together with China within the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. This is a very important step, a first step, of course, but a very important first step to seek more international comparability between two key taxonomies with the view to exactly enable interoperability, which is in line with the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group recommendation you was mentioning. Let me just briefly recall what is the Common Ground Taxonomy. Is a comparison, is not a self-standing global sustainable green finance taxonomy per se. It is a technical and non-binding document for voluntary reference by an interested party within the scope of the comparison exercise, of course. And the scope of this first exercise covers only for the time being the climate change mitigation objective and the comparison of certain features, but other features will be assessed. Yet, this exercise already provides more clarity and transparency about the commonalities and the differences between the EU and the Chinese taxonomy, and it is expected to play an essential role in increasing comparability and interoperability of sustainable finance taxonomy globally. This would then eventually contribute to lowering the transboundary cost of green investment and scaling up the mobilization of green capital international. So that's why the IPSF, the platform, aims at extending this exercise to cover other environmental objectives and other taxonomies in the future.
Rafaela, if I may, so how do you see maybe lumping the second question before we go to Marielle, since you're already talking about the CGT and the work that the IPSF has been doing, also contributing to the G20. How do you see that work? That work can help what we're starting here today. What were the sort of the key learnings, and maybe referring back to the G20 principles, what would you highlight as, what would you prioritize there?
Okay, if I can, okay, first of all, we believe that the structure and the ambition of the EU taxonomy is a source of inspiration for this working group, the Latin American Caribbean Working Group reflection, and also the methodology that has been developed by the IPSF for the Common Ground Taxonomy can also be factored in this work. Now, if I have to come to the principles I was referring, which have been developed by the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, with the contribution of the international, the IPSF, the international platform, as knowledge partner. I believe that these principles can guide the work on taxonomies. How? First, to facilitate interoperability across markets, policymakers should use a common language and standards and tools. Adopting a common language, for instance, international standard industrial classification and common standards and metrics, increases the coherence between developed and developing country taxonomy and can reduce the burden for global investors. Second, it is essential that when making a positive contribution to support at least one of the Sustainable Development Goals, taxonomy should ensure that activities do not harm significantly any other objectives, and safeguards to ensure that a positive contribution on one objective is not going to be outweighed by negative impact on the others is important. So that's why we have in view the do not significant harm principle and minimum social safeguards. Third, taxonomies to be interoperable should be science-based. By developing objective taxonomy supported by clearly defined and disclosed metrics and thresholds, the Latin America taxonomy that are developed may thus ensure that they are internationally interoperable. Fourth, taxonomies are dynamic. So it's not a rigid, static classification system. And so the working group, this working group should cover future regular reviews and updates to reflect the development of science, of green and sustainable technology, as well as the change of both the domestic and the international policy agendas and priorities. Finally, taxonomy can also and should address transition considerations. We believe that taxonomy is one of the key tools to help companies and investors navigate in the transition and ensure that markets are credible, transparent, comparable, and accountable over time. So with the taxonomy, companies can better disclose their alignment with sustainability objectives based on performance criteria, and also can use it for target setting and tracking the progress along the transition. So therefore, we encourage the LAC working group to consider transition aspect and to consider also the discussion we are taking place here on how taxonomies can support the transition. I mean, to conclude, I will say that we need to acknowledge that there are, as was mentioned before, different starting points and different trajectories. And in certain countries or regions, certain aspects of taxonomies may need to be adapted. For instance, they may need to adapt the level of activity granularity in the taxonomy compared to, for instance, developed countries' taxonomies. And on this, the regional cooperation aiming at developing a common ground taxonomy, as opposed to a large number of very divergent national taxonomies, can help avoiding unnecessary market segmentation and illiquid sustainable finance market. The IPSF has recommended such regional collaboration and encouraged international organization and multilateral development banks in this region to play a role in coordinating or assisting with the development of these taxonomies. And I will conclude that we welcome again the Latin America and Caribbean Working Group, as regional approaches to taxonomies offer prospects in terms of adapting sustainable investment approaches to local circumstances, while at the same time maintaining a level of ambition and a certain degree of interoperability. And I will.
Thank you very much, Rafael. And at the end of the day, it is about capital mobilization. And yeah, so as you were saying, a couple of the challenges that interoperability helps overcome: reducing consistencies, make capital flows more efficiencies, avoid greenwashing. I like the word harmonization in the sense that in a harmony, one can have different nodes, right? Not all the nodes are the same, but they play well together. So let me turn over to Marielle. Marielle, CBI has done great work in Latin America, helping mobilize capital markets, helping jumpstart the green bond market in LATAM. And maybe again, lumping the two questions together in the interest of times. Do you see a sustained interest from regulators in LATAM in the adoption of taxonomies? Where do you see the trend going when you compare to other markets? And how can this interoperability that we're talking about help further mobilize capital in the region and further catalyze thematic bond markets? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. It's a great pleasure and honor to be speaking on this panel. I'd like to congratulate on the launch of the GTTT LAC Working Group on Taxonomies, because I'm a great believer that taxonomy can really be the tool that enables sustainable investment at scale, and I thank everybody for their interest in the topic. So indeed, Marcos, thanks for your recognition of the work of CBI on the topic. CBI is now observing that more than 40 governments and regulators are developing taxonomies in the world. So Sean Kidney, our CEO, has dubbed this the taxonomania. Yeah. So very briefly, yes, it is there. Yes, it is increasing. Like in the 2 last weeks, I had 2 new requests for supports from some regulators, national regulators, to develop a taxonomy. Very briefly, why? What is pushing this interest? The first interest for regulators is the urgent need to measure which investment is sustainable or not. In some jurisdictions which are developing or have taxonomies like China and India, it goes as far as already incentivizing sustainable finance with these taxonomies. And I think that many regulators are thinking forward. Once the measurement is done, how can we use the taxonomy to put fiscal or regulatory incentives to direct capital? So that's one motive. The other motive that drives, I think, the development of taxonomy is the huge amounts that were quoted on this panel before of capital that is desiring to be invested with ESG criteria, right? ESG savings are spurring everywhere. So ESG is very often focused on financial materiality first, but more and more a segment of this ESG saving is asking for impact. Yeah, I want to have impact on the environment, impact on climate change, impact on natural capital, and so on. So for impact measurement, the taxonomies are the answer. And I think that the desire of ESG, and in recent days, there have been very strong moves in Europe, at least, around greenwashing and ESG greenwashing claims. So taxonomies are an answer to that. Now, in terms of interoperability, I also think that the EU taxonomy has been a great catalyst of taxonomies development in the world, because it has made the EU taxonomy, the taxonomy concept more familiar, right? China had the taxonomy before the EU, but China is not integrated as much as the EU into the global world, or not in the same way, shall we say. So the launch of the EU taxonomy was a great start of this taxonomania and the desire for interoperability. So on this, what I would say, without betraying secrets, is that many of the regulators and governments CBI is advising are asking us to develop taxonomies that are EU compatible, right? So the idea of interoperability is already there. I think it's great. I think it's very important. The EU is a region like LATAM, and I think that interoperability is obviously necessary, particularly for issuers and particularly for corporate issuers, because corporate issuers are very often global companies, and they cannot go to the market with only the evidence of their local taxonomy alignment in the EU or in China or in LATAM. It's clear that they want to showcase their sustainability everywhere. So for this, interoperability is necessary. So we are running short of time, I think. So I will be very brief and say that what I think LATAM and this new LAC working group could bring to the picture. So this is just my personal view. First of all, I think that the EU taxonomy has developed the sectors that are the most relevant to the EU economy. There are other sectors which are more relevant maybe to LATAM economies, like mining, like agriculture, and the transition concept is not yet fully developed or fully publicly developed in the EU. So maybe the LATAM could push interoperability forward by advancing topics that the EU has not or not yet advanced. That's one thing. And the other thing that I would like to say is that the EU taxonomy is now entering the phase of implementation. Yeah. So the corporates in the EU are starting to report. The banks are starting to report. What do we do with sovereign bonds in the EU taxonomy? What do we do with trading books? What do we exactly, how do we exactly adjust economic activity to the corporate business? So what I think is that there is a very fruitful way that LATAM can learn from where the EU is at the moment and go faster, right? For me, interoperability is also understanding what is clearly working, what is needing adjustment, what is complex, like the DNSH in the EU taxonomy, and brainstorming on that so as that we all together reach quickly interoperable, simple, easy taxonomy that will spur issuance and investing, because this is what we need. So I'll conclude there. Of course, CBI is here to help, but I think many people on this panel are here to help. As Graham Watkins, I think, was saying, this is a common work. will be there only if we work together. And very pleased again, and congratulations to the G20 LAC to create and to participate in this common effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Muriel. And so maybe just to wrap up the panel, since I'm being told we have a pre-recorded message from Majun, but in the interest of time, the coordination team is telling me that the video will be posted online. Maybe one final message or key recommendation that you would like regulators, financial regulators, and ministries of environment to take forward or to consider as this work carries forward in LATAM. Muriel, Rafaela, I don't know who wants to take the floor first.
Since I have the microphone, if I may, Rafaela, very quickly, I would say think of interoperability very early on.
Thank you very much. Rafaela, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Marcos. I mean, I will just recall the principles that I mentioned. Think about these principles when develop the taxonomy. Think about common language, positive contribution, and not harm the other objective. Science-based taxonomy, dynamic taxonomy, and taxonomy embedding transition consideration. So my recommendation would be, let's look at those principles, take inspiration from what has been done, and also from the methodology that we have been developed to compare different taxonomies, because this is the key to get the interoperability.
What a great way to close the panel, and I'm sure we'll be reaching out proactively to both CBI and the IPSF as this process evolves in Latin America. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Let me now turn over to the next panelist, and to our moderator, a good friend, Marcela Ponce, head of Climate Finance at the IFC. Marcela, the floor is all yours.
Many thanks, Marcos and Rafaela and Mariel, because I think that was a very good panel. Let me switch to Spanish, porque pasamos ahora a un panel completo.
I'm going to go into Spanish because we're going to a Latin American panel. We welcome Juan Ernesto Jimenez, intendant of the securities market in the Dominican Republic. I can't see him. Okay, now he is here. Yeah. Mariana Escobar, who is the head of climate finance at the financial superintendents in Colombia, and Alejandro Manriquez, who is coordinator of financial analysis and international liaison at the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico. I think that at this point in the event, we're not going to explain green taxonomies, just a very brief introduction from the IFC and the World Bank and Group. We have been working in Latin America with 9 countries, supporting them in defining their national taxonomies with different visions. This is why the panelists we have today will bring important views to us. We have been doing so to increase sustainable financing, green financing in the region, which is part of our commitments concerning the fact that 35% of everything we finance has to be green to 2030, and the commitments of being completely aligned with Paris to 2025. So we work with supervisors and regulators, and this is part of our call in the World Bank in the different initiatives we have as the networking for banking and finances. Having said this, and with our time limitations, I'd like to start the panel speaking with Mariana. Of the 9 countries we have been working with, Colombia is the first country where we launched the green taxonomy. And I think that one of the big achievements we have, as they said in former panels, is how we learn from experiences, lessons, failures, good things, so as not to reinvent the wheel and be more efficient. Mariana, can you tell us what is the scope of the green taxonomy? I'm going to be very strict with time so we can finish in time. I'll cut you, sorry. So what's the scope of the green taxonomy in Colombia, and how this is linked to what we have heard in the webinar, the principles towards building this taxonomy? Thank you, Marcela. First of all, and the most important thing, and I think I'll start from the principles because that is tied to the scope. For developing our taxonomy, we established a number of building principles, and these principles would guide us in future development, updating, additional and complementary development. This is why we wanted to establish these principles to give continuity to our process and take advantage of learnings. The principles you can see in the taxonomy are related to best international practices, and the most important is defining priority environmental objectives for each country. We're seeing that these objectives have slight changes between countries and jurisdictions, but there are differences. Differently from the European Union, in Colombia, for example, they have 6 objectives, we have 7. We have sustainable use of soil, which is very important for our sustainable development in Colombia. We have that difference, for example. That's the first principle. The second principle, and there's a link between each principle, it is choosing eligibility criteria. To continue with the process and use lessons, every taxonomy needs to have eligibility criteria. Each activity needs a definition with a quantitative, qualitative threshold that will allow taxonomy users understand what is the performance that asset needs to have to contribute to prioritized objectives. The third one has to do with aligning with international industrial codes. This has to do with interoperability internationally. At local level, we use the SIU codes, and those are the ones we associate to different assets. It's very important to clarify that we don't need to create new activities or objectives within the existing frameworks. Some will not have exact equivalences, but they will be approximative. And in this way, we'll be able to more efficiently interoperate. The third one has to do with risk management, applying the no harm principle Europeans have. In our case, the concept is a bit broader. It's managing risk. We want to make sure that whatever contributes to one objective does not go in detriment of another objective. This is why we include environmental, social environmental risk when we classify or align with the taxonomy. The last principle has to do with aligning with other taxonomies. Many of the principles I mentioned before reflect the commitment we have with establishing and maintaining a similar structure, architecture with the European Union and other taxonomies. We need to build upon what is built, but taking into account the local context. In the Colombian case, this first taxonomy starts by trying to mitigate climate change. We have 50 activities in in 10 economic sectors with eligibility criteria, and for soil use sectors, agriculture, forestry, and ranching, we have identified mitigation practices that contribute to 5 of the 7 environmental objectives. I stop there to give some time to others. Thank you. Marcela, thank you. Mariana, excellent, because among the things you mentioned in the former panel, they mentioned interoperability, common languages, etc. Now, I pass the floor to Juan Ernesto. In Colombia, the supervisor and the financial ministry led the taxonomy. In the Dominican Republic, it's the superintendents of the securities market. Yeah, of course. In Dominican Republic, this revolution of sustainable finance started in 2019 in the general meeting of the EOS. Following that concern in our country of starting to get into green finance, we worked with the IDB on the guidelines for issuing sustainable securities that were social and green. Our strategy was not to create a regulation, but a strategy of inviting companies to be issuers under these guidelines, as we see in other countries such as in Argentina. We published this in 2020 as a result of a green table, round table that was created. We started to work with the IFC, and we had an understanding agreement first because we saw that the Dominican Republic still lacked definitions that could have been agreed upon formally. But we saw other experiences that had positive environmental impacts in green assets or activities, and that are an important development for this kind of instrument. So as a result of that, we launched the Green Taxonomy project, and the idea was to launch it to generate new tools that could contribute with changing our environmental impact in the context of climate change and promoting sustainability through the securities market. In that regard, we saw the importance of including other important actors so this could be carried out. Therefore, we created the monitoring committee, where we include the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Finance, and that was then broadened to the central bank.
Se identifican los sectores.
We continued from there by identifying other sectors once we defined our work plan. The sectors in which the Dominican Republic, the sectors which the Dominican Republic selected were energy, transportation, construction, ITCs, industry, water, and waste. I would say that we are aware about the importance of green finance and climate change. It must be a strategy that invites different actors, both public and private. And obviously, it's an important seal in our passport to have an entity such as the IFC with us. Thank you very much, Juan Ernesto. Yes, and just to put the audience into context, one of the main reasons for which the financial sector is so important is because most of the capital that needs to be aimed at this has to pass by financial institutions and banking. And the most important instruments we have in the capital market is green bonds. And we want to have green bonds that are transparent and reliable. Therefore, the taxonomy contributes to knowing what are the kinds of assets that can be financed in Dominican Republic. That's why it's so important. Thank you very much, Juan Ernesto. Now we go to Alejandro. I go in order with the taxonomies we are talking about. Besides these three countries, we're working with Central America and Peru, but I love to go to the Mexican example. Alejandro, how do you see the Mexican taxonomy, which is slightly different from other countries? I think your experience is super valuable. And perhaps you can also talk about the relevance of interoperability for you. Thank you very much, Marcela. Good morning to you all. First of all, and very briefly, I'd like to thank the different UN nations and multilateral organizations for inviting us to share the case of the Mexican taxonomy and for the initiative of this Latin American Working Group. International cooperation and these exchange forums are very valuable to ensure that we have a robust taxonomy for the region that is interoperable and aligned with global best practices. Before starting, I'd like to give you some context for our taxonomy. I refer to how this taxonomy is framed in a broader sustainable finance agenda in the Mexican government. We have worked in different budgetary initiatives, creating different multi-sector mechanisms, designing and implementing different sustainable financing instruments for the country. And the taxonomy that has been developed for a couple of years is one more of these elements making up this sustainable finance agenda and strategy. So we understand that one of the main components that can underpin mobilizing capitals and resources to sustainable activities is taxonomy. The Mexican taxonomy is not an isolated effort. It is one component more of a number of activities and initiatives that promote sustainable development in our country. An important point in the taxonomy characteristics is the institutional framework in which it is developed. I think it's an experience shared with many countries. There are different initiatives that are fragmented. In the case of Mexico, we observed this 3 years ago in the private sector in developing banking in different productive companies. I lost him, I'm sorry. I understand that it's a problem in Alejandro's connection. Can you hear me? You can't hear Alejandro, right? While Alejandro comes back with his connection, I'll go back to Mariana, because after having gone through the design of the green taxonomy, we have the implementation challenge. Mariana, what do you think about this implementation of your green taxonomy, and also perhaps talk about collaborative work with other institutions? Yeah, of course, Marcela. In Colombia, when we designed our taxonomy and started building it, we knew that this taxonomy was a technical document based upon technical debate and science, and that reflected the possibilities of context, targets, commitments, etc., around the environment in Colombia.
diseño y cuando estábamos pensando cuáles era
but it was a document that could have multiple uses. Mobilization of resources was the most important thing, but we also wanted to track expenditure, public expenditure, and we needed to track also private capital mobilization and also the design of other public policies. Oftentimes, when developing countries get into this exercise, an important effort, it took us 2 years, then we considered it was relevant to have multiple uses when we were in the design process. For the superintendents, which is the supervision authority for the securities market and financial institutions, we decided the initial implementation of the taxonomy had to be very much related to sustainable products. In different jurisdictions, they have different implementations by supervisors related to corporate education, and we wanted to take the first steps around product sustainability disclosure. They had to say they were aligned to the green taxonomy. We have developed 3 regulations: the Green Bond Circular that refers to taxonomy and the use of funds. Circular 31 establishes instructions for reporting and disclosure to our superintendent for vehicles and issuers of securities in Colombia. So they had to disclose their alignment, and Circular 5 this year that formalized that when we spoke about green taxonomy, that would apply for pension fund products. So there are 3 products we are requesting to be aligned if they have a green name, a green branding. Future implementation can have many facets. So we have started to work on measuring, talent measuring of mobilization, because this was a second objective in our taxonomy. We have been working with consultants and the UK Pact in taxonomy pilots with our banks in Colombia. We're checking how aligned their green portfolios are to the principles we mentioned of non-harming, green taxonomy, etc. And we want to compare apples with apples. So we are doing work on the behavior of these assets so as to have financial policies or regulations facilitating capital mobilization. Thank you very much. Perhaps someone from the United Nations could help us give admission to Alejandro, because he's in the admission room. Juan Ernesto, in this model that everything is connected, as Alejandro mentioned in his introduction and what Mariana mentioned, what do you see are the biggest challenges you will face in the Dominican Republic? What are the opportunities you see for this taxonomy to connect different points on green finance in the country? The first challenge for us is being able to include the private sector among our initiative promoters, because our country is not always well regarded when regulators promote. This is why I said that the strategy means inviting the private sector. We don't use restrictive regulatory terms, but definitions, standardization, because fortunately, there are multinational companies in the financial sector that have expressed their capacity to invest institutionally in green instruments, and that they do not do so because there aren't available instruments. So in the working tables, we stress the need for capital and that this capital can reach us through green instruments according to this definition, standardization, and taxonomy. Thank you very much, Juan Ernesto. Undoubtedly, that private-public dialogue that we will see in the following panel is super relevant. Alejandro, I pass the floor to you, but we have no more time, 4 or 5 minutes. Can you give us an idea of where you started? Thank you, Marcela. Colleagues, excuse me, I had technical problems on my side. Because of time, I'd like to highlight the moment we are in our taxonomy here in Mexico. Last year, we were working in the framework of sustainable finance in the methodological conceptual development of taxonomy in our country. In this phase, we identified strategic and specific objectives, developing methodologies for metrics and thresholds for the phase of implementing the taxonomy in this matter. I want to highlight the great value added of international cooperation and technical aid for all these activities, and also highlight the relevance of having this kind of coaching to ensure interoperability, make sure that taxonomic developments are aligned to best international practices that respond and acknowledge the other cases and more advanced experiences in the world. I think that the coaching we received here in Mexico has been key to make sure that developing the taxonomy in our country is developed to the aligned to the European Union. We took some of the Chinese case and also some from the CBI. What is peculiar in Mexico is that this is a sustainable taxonomy. It takes environmental and climate components worked globally, but importantly stressing the social component, evidently because of a priority of this for countries such as Mexico, and why this is so much a priority for other countries in the region. A work group is this one, a working group is this one, can help us to exchange good practices, identify coincidences, capitalizing those coincidences, and acknowledging common topics and challenges in the region. In 2022, we're going towards implementation that has to do with applying the elements we developed last year to go towards identifying and defining metrics and thresholds for different economic activities, strategic sectors, which in Mexico's taxonomy are aligned with the SDGs, particularly gender, sustainable cities, and climate change. Towards the future, we have thought about a first draft of our taxonomy experiences, and then we will do piloting of what has been worked out. It will be important to have support and coaching of international cooperation and other national and international financial players. I leave it at that, and thank you again. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Mariana and Juan Ernesto, I think that standardization, public-private dialogue, common languages, aligning with international standards are like the key words here. Collaboration is fundamental. internal collaboration inside the country among their different institutions, but also with international organizations, as Alejandro said. I say goodbye with this, and I pass the floor to Jose Luis Samaniego from ECLAC to talk about the public-private dialogue tables as mechanisms to promote the transition towards a low-emission and climate-resilient economy. Thank you very much. So we go to this panel, as it has been said. We have two guests, Joaquin Guajardo from Chile and Olga Cantillo from Panama. I will join the questions because we are running out of time. So each one of you responds in your intervention. The first question is, why is it necessary to work public sector and private sector hand in hand? And the second is, what steps are you taking to go ahead in designing sustainable financial taxonomies, and what are the valuable elements according to your experience? We'll start with Joaquin Guajardo, coordinator of the Public-Private Table on Green Finance at the Ministry of Finance in Chile. Joaquin, you have the floor. Hello, how are you? Thank you very much for inviting me to comment about these topics of much interest and that are being developed and are so current for all of Latin America. Concerning the first question about the importance and role of this roundtable and this public-private collaboration, we understand it as that it points to the heart of a taxonomy. The taxonomy needs to be useful. It's a language. We have to agree on categories that are based on scientific evidence and that have a common understanding to then make decisions of different kinds. This is why it's fundamental to have close collaboration between public and private sectors about how we understand as green in all the spectrum of economic activities being developed in the country. Therefore, hand in hand with that, or together with that, the taxonomy is a public policy tool because we align categories and definitions on what is green and what is the degree, what are the thresholds of what is environmentally sustainable and what is not, and also taking into account the country's objectives. At the Ministry of Finance, we have to be aligned to our climate commitments and the NDC. They are commitments that go beyond the public sector. It requires coordinated efforts of public and private sectors, particularly the financial sector that channels the investment flows towards these activities. Concerning the importance of public-private collaboration, that's our vision. Concerning the experience and current status of taxonomy in Chile, it is precisely in this round table that is public and private in which we develop the roadmap to develop a green taxonomy. This debate from the start was public and private. This was a roadmap published last year, and we are progressing in a preparatory committee about the structure of this taxonomy. We're working on environmental objectives, classification of economic activity system, how we will prioritize different sectors, all those discussions that have to do with the foundations of our future taxonomy. That also summarizes the second question. That's it. Thank you. Any valuable experience you would like to highlight? Oh, yeah. concerning public-private collaboration. It is through dialogue, because that roadmap document was shared with different members. It was prepared in collaboration with the CIB and CBI and the IDB, but as an expert that ensures interoperability and all these aspects we have been mentioning, I have to say that we got into this and tried to understand this, because it's a new topic in the financial sector. That is a very good exercise of internal induction, and the roundtable is based upon trust and reliability between both parties, and the environment of collaboration and dialogue is what has been made this possible, and we're very happy about the work being done in this regard. So a key word is generating trust. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Jose Luis Samaniego. I'm director of the Division of Sustainable Development and Human Settlements at LAC. And now we go to the private sector itself. We're going to ask the same two questions. Why is it important? Where are you at right now, and what experiences do you want to highlight? I'm asking Olga Cantillo, Executive Vice President, General Manager of the Latin American Stock Exchange, Latinx Panama. Thank you. Good morning to you all. Thank you for inviting us, for being able to share our initiatives and different actions in Panama. To respond to the first question, I would repeat what has been said in today's webinar. One is the need to talk in the same language. We need to haste our pace in this, and we can't do so if public and private sectors don't collaborate, and even less so if we have different regulations that are unfriendly. The Dominican Republican superintendent talked about inviting and not imposing. That's critical. There are many things to say in Panama. I start by saying that the Environment Ministry has different initiatives, a very good roadmap for Panama, and some of the topics that have to do with today's webinar are two programs launched at the end last year. In Latinx, we partake in them. One of them is a declaration of carbon neutral organizations, and a second one is reduce your corporate footprint. These programs support public and private organizations to manage their carbon footprint, decrease their impact in environment, society, increase efficiency, reduce costs, document everything in our documentation concerning fighting global climate change. And we have a number of indicators led by environment and by the Ministry of Economy and Finance based upon results established by the GEF, GIZ, the World Bank, the UNDP, all aiming at facilitating access to international climate financing for all kinds of projects. And we have been working in collaboration with sustainable finance for the Panama financial sector to have a taxonomy for the Panamanian financial sector. We have been working on this based upon updating the taxonomy financing of the European Union and the GEF. It will be made official in the readiness, and in 1 year we will have this taxonomy for our financial sector. Now, talking about the second question. In Latinx, We are very clear in terms of market infrastructure of what our role is. In that regard, we have an important role in developing sustainable finance for Panama. We promote emission reduction, climate risk, and actions that support companies that are listed in the stock exchange to share their best practices on corporate governance, social, and environmental objectives. We are adhere to a number of initiatives like the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges, the World Federation of Stock Exchanges, etc. In 2018, we created with UNP5 and with ANCON, which is now called Latinx, we created the working group on sustainable finance. We created this group to develop a national roadmap for sustainable finance for the financing sector, attending to ESG, environment, social, and governance, concerning risk, resource intermediation, and securities in the Panamanian system. We want the financial system to support an inclusive, resilient, and sustainable economy that promotes human well-being, environment conservation, the SDGs of the United Nations, and the Paris Agreement on climate change. This is why that we have been working in this very important project of the national taxonomy first sector. A key factor in the success of this is that from the start, we have had the participation of the public and private sectors together. Banking, securities, insurance, cooperatives, private companies, multilateral banking, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Economy and Finance, regulators of banking, insurance, and securities. We have developed a program of training on sustainable finance, on risk management, regarding ESG, on taxonomy, and promoting the adoption of specific sustainability standards for our members. Thank you very much.
Sí, disculpas. Bueno, quiero agradecer a ambos muchísimo su participación.
Thank you very much for your participation. I know that we are delayed, and that's why I consolidated both questions in one. LAC is very much interested not only on taxonomies, but also on risk management and being able to have an accounting of the net financing being given to sustainable development. Thank you very much to Joaquin Guajardo, coordinator of the public-private table on the Green Finance, Ministry of Finance, Chile, and Olga Cantilla, executive vice president and general manager of the Latin American Stock Exchange, Latinx Panama. I pass the floor to Mercedes Pariña, who is program manager officer at UNEP Latin America and the Caribbean office, colleague that works with us in this venture. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jose Luis, and thank you to the former panelists. In this closing panel, we will have Vishwas Vijayaranya participate and me. We have a brief presentation. I don't know if the team can help us project the presentation. Do I see it in the screen? Okay, very well. Can we perhaps go to the following? Please, and the following one.
Ahí nos podemos parar. Muchas gracias.
Yeah, we can stop there.
Bueno, como parte de este panel de cierre, pues vamos a presentar brevemente el plan de trabajo y la metodología que vamos a seguir desde el grupo de taxonomía de América Latina y el Caribe, pues para el desarrollo del marco común de taxonomías de finanzas sostenibles para la región. Dicho marco específicamente para la región, pues estará pues basado en ciencia, considerará las especificaciones de los países de la región y se enfocará en una primera instancia en actividades de mitigación y adaptación al cambio climático. En una fase posterior, desde el grupo de trabajo de taxonomía de América Latina y el Caribe, pues aumentaremos el alcance de este marco común pues, a otros objetivos ambientales. Dicho esto, el marco común de taxonomías de finanzas sostenibles para América Latina y el Caribe, pues también establecerá una serie de principios comunes que además de servir como guía para los Estados miembros de la región para desarrollar sus taxonomías nacionales, facilitarán la interoperabilidad, ¿no? La palabra que se ha repetido tanto durante el evento, pues de las diferentes taxonomías nacionales de la región y estos principios pues estarán también armonizados a su vez con otras taxonomías internacionales, así como con otros esfuerzos internacionales de desarrollo de taxonomías, tales como los llevados a cabo por la Plataforma Internacional de Finanzas Sostenibles o por el Grupo de Trabajo de Finanzas Sostenibles del propio G20, ¿no? Con la finalidad última pues, de facilitar la identificación de oportunidades de inversión ambientalmente sostenibles para el sector privado, específicamente para los participantes de los mercados financieros, no solamente nacionales, sino regionales y transfronterizos. A continuación vamos a entrar un poco más en detalle técnico de cuál va a ser esta metodología a seguir para el desarrollo del marco común específico para la región de América Latina y el Caribe, para lo cual pues le paso la palabra y al mismo tiempo pues aprovecho para presentar a nuestro aliado técnico del grupo de trabajo que se llama Biswas, y él es director de Bayer. Ha participado en el desarrollo y la implementación de taxonomías de finanzas sostenibles, no solamente en la región, sino también a nivel internacional. Algunos ejemplos son, por ejemplo, la taxonomía de Colombia, la hoja de ruta de Chile, con República Dominicana, la taxonomía de la Unión Europea, también ejercicios de taxonomías regionales, como por ejemplo la de ASEAN, o también ha participado en ejercicios de desarrollo de marco común, como el llevado a cabo en la Plataforma Internacional de Finanzas Sostenibles entre la taxonomía de China y de la Unión Europea. Entonces, sin más preámbulos, te dejo presentar la parte metodológica más técnica. Gracias.
Framework. Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. We're presenting our methodology, how we are developing the common framework. It's important to have harmonization among taxonomies, and this common framework will help in doing so regionally. Next one, please. As we know, there are many taxonomies, many policies, many progress made on environmental change and sustainable finance, not only in the region, but also globally. So we started with research on work done on international agreements, capital flows, publications, and taxonomies as such. In taxonomies, next one, please. We have reviewed all international common frameworks and international taxonomies, also taxonomies in the region like Colombia, and there are 8 countries more developing their taxonomies in the region. So we reviewed them, their main objectives, how they tackled with these objectives, how they selected them, what were the prioritized sectors in these taxonomies, how they addressed them, and what activities they included in the sectors and the eligibility criteria. Next one. In all of this, when we take a look at the common framework of the ALC taxonomy or LAC taxonomy, these are important points. First of all, aligning with taxonomies that have already been made, that are being developed, also policies focusing climate change. In the first stage, we will address climate change issues, and then we will broaden to other environmental and social objectives in the future. This is, well, we have alignment, harmonization, not only in terms of decent work, but also being able to link with other international taxonomies, particularly European Union one. It has to be based on science and go towards decarbonization, fair transition in different sectors, being inclusive also. Many countries have developed climate policies and climate change issues. Others need more help. There are countries that need much more support in adaptation terms, others in mitigation. So the idea is to include these different approaches in the region. Next one, please.
Empezamos con investigación secundaria, mirando.
So we started with secondary research, looking at the key elements all these taxonomies have, their objectives, how they address them, how they selected them, their taxonomy structures. There are different kinds of structures. Some taxonomies have specific criteria. There are other taxonomies that have differential thresholds. Other taxonomies are based on principles. The idea is to review all this. And concerning interoperability, taking a look at the industrial codes they use and how we can use them to harmonize with others. The common ground taxonomy is very important for this, and user applications that were the main instruments they used in their taxonomies development process and governance for developing national and regional taxonomies and for implementation once we have the taxonomy. Next one, please. These were part of our secondary review. We had consultations with stakeholders like public entities, the Environment Ministry, the Economy Ministry, regulators, multilateral organizations involved in developing taxonomies, NGOs, experts, and scholars. We used many elements, IPCC, IEA, IHA have used, and consultants and experts in the region that know all these sectors. Why do we have so many players? The idea is to use different tools focused on different topics, having surveys where we can have feedback, consulting with experts with different sectors, and regular debates we have with the participants of the group that work on this. What we are going to have, first of all, is background and context in the region and some considerations. Here we're talking about key principles on which this taxonomy can be based upon. The framework itself, in the framework we will talk about prioritizing sectors, and for all those prioritized sectors we will have a guideline on how they have to address criteria. We talk about construction. What are the pathways to develop all these thresholds so they are harmonized and comply with principles? How can we address transition issues so important for a number of countries in the region, for example, energy transition, and how can we exclude possibilities such as fossil fuels, for example, etc. Uses fuels, yeah. This is our timeline. We are closing the stage in which we review all the existing information, and we're starting to prioritize sectors and start developing the taxonomy. The idea is to have the common framework at the end of November, to be published in November or December.
A ver si... Vale, ahora se me escucha, ¿verdad, Vish?
Can you hear me?
Ah,
Yes.
perfecto. Gracias.
Okay, very well. Thank you very much.
Sí, básicamente el primer entregable, como mencionaba Vish, es el mapeo del panorama de las taxonomías de finanzas sostenibles internacionales y regionales que se han desarrollado, que están actualmente en desarrollo, ¿no? Y básicamente es una evaluación granular de las diferencias y los puntos en común entre las taxonomías, ¿no? Y esto ya tenemos un primer borrador actualmente. Está en fase de consulta entre los miembros del grupo de trabajo y entre otras contrapartes. Entonces pronto, en las próximas semanas, podremos tener un documento final, ¿no? Como siguiente entregable, tenemos un primer borrador del propio marco común de taxonomías, ¿no? de finanzas sostenibles para la región de América Latina, el cual pues considerará elementos clave como los mencionados por Visuas anteriormente, ¿no? El objetivo, la estructura de la taxonomía, componentes, selección de sectores económicos, la clasificación de los sectores económicos por códigos industriales, aplicaciones, usuarios, guías sobre cómo desarrollar las taxonomías nacionales a través del uso de este marco común, sobre los procesos también de gobernanza en relación con el desarrollo, implementación y actualización, ¿no? de las taxonomías nacionales. Entonces, todo este marco común, un primer borrador, pues lo tenemos previsto para el 4, entre agosto y septiembre de este año. Aquí tenemos un margen un poquito ahí de un mes, porque depende también de cuánto tarde el levantamiento de información para el desarrollo de este marco común. Hay información que, como decía Visuas, es de primera mano y hay otra que es de fuentes secundarias. Entonces, por eso tenemos ese margen ahí que veis en el plan de trabajo. Pero luego se abre un proceso de revisión que es de un par de meses, donde se abren estos procesos de consulta con estos actores clave de la región, ministerios de ambiente, economía y finanzas, reguladores y supervisores financieros, academia, ONG, para hacer una revisión de este marco y terminar con un reporte final y con un marco común, de alguna manera aprobado, ¿no? por todos los actores también del grupo de trabajo, pues, a final de año, ¿no? Dependiendo también entre noviembre y diciembre, dependiendo cuánto tarden pues estas revisiones. Y bueno, la siguiente. Yo me paro aquí, no sé si en la parte de siguientes pasos y cronogramas quisieras completar algo más.
And next steps. No, Mercedes, it's okay.
Vale, pues bueno, yo creo que con esto vamos ya súper pegados bueno, de hecho bastante retrasados para finalizar el evento del día de hoy. Entonces, bueno, desde el grupo de trabajo de taxonomías de América Latina y el Caribe, pues les agradecemos a todos los panelistas y moderadores por su participación en el evento del día de hoy. Especial agradecimiento a la Comisión Europea y el programa Euroclima, quien está apoyando pues el desarrollo de este trabajo, básicamente del grupo de trabajo de taxonomías de América Latina y el Caribe. Ha sido súper interesante el conversatorio de la mano con líderes en el desarrollo de taxonomías de finanzas sostenibles, tanto de la esfera internacional como regional. Y bueno, pues hemos sacado insumos de especial relevancia para el futuro desarrollo de este marco común para la región, y con la finalidad última de pues, apuntalar la movilización de flujos financieros transfronterizos hacia la transición de una economía regional baja en emisiones y resiliente al clima. Muchísimas gracias también a la audiencia, que hemos mantenido muchísima gente conectada durante el live, durante todo el evento y de diferentes regiones, así que mil gracias por estar ahí conectados y que tengan muy buen día. Os dejamos ahora en continuación con el vídeo de Mayun, que anunció anteriormente mi colega Marcos Martini, y lo pueden
video
continuar
of
viendo
Matt Jones,
en
and
este
you can
mismo link. Gracias. Buen día.
continue watching this video at the same thing. I'm sorry, the same link. Thank you very much.
Working Group, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me to join this very important discussion. I apologize for not being able to attend real time, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak through this pre-recorded video. I like to spend 10-15 minutes talking about the IPSF or Common Ground Taxonomy and how it may contribute to the interoperability of taxonomy around the world. I have a PowerPoint. Just 1 second, let me upload. Here we go. The topic of my talk today is IPSF Common Ground Taxonomy, which refers to the International Platform for System of Finance Working Group that's been working on the Common Ground Taxonomy. Let me start by giving a few thoughts on why we need a taxonomy. This is largely based on my personal experience of working on Chinese taxonomies in the past many years. In China, we started developing the first taxonomy as early as in 2013. That was the Green Lending Taxonomy. And then in 2015, I led the drafting of the first Chinese Green Bond Taxonomy. And later, we had the Green Project Taxonomy, which provided the basis for unifying all other kinds of taxonomies within the country. And throughout these years, we had a lot of usage of different taxonomies. And these are a couple of lessons and experiences that I would summarize. Number one, a taxonomy can prevent greenwashing by providing a basis for labeling and verification, essentially labeling the green activities, green assets. And without a taxonomy, everybody would claim that I own or I launch a green activity, and there's no sort of common basis for verifying or labeling such activity, which could create a lot of opportunity for greenwashing. The second usage is provide a basis for performance measurement and disclosure. In China, disclosure by banks are required against the green lending taxonomy. Initially to the authorities, namely the banks were required to report the amount of green loans, the growth rates of green loans, the environmental benefits of the green loans, as well as many other related indicators such as NPL of green loans to the authority. And more recently, they were reporting such information to the general public and to the market. And some of these measures, which I mentioned, are actually performance measurements. They can be used to judge whether a financial institution or a company is doing better or worse in terms of green and the sustainability. And the third usage of taxonomy is actually based on performance measurement. The government can allocate policy incentives. For example, the central bank in China offers decarbonization facility, which is a low-cost funding facility through commercial banks to the green projects. And the local governments in China offer subsidies for interest payments and guarantees for green projects. And all such incentives are allocated based on the projects or the bank's performance against the green taxonomy. And finally, provides a basis for product development, which is quite clear. If you develop green loans and green bonds, you have to basically define these products against the taxonomy. And if you package certain green assets, for example, produce a green bond fund, and then all these bonds within the bond fund need to qualify the requirement from the taxonomy. And also green loans can be packaged into a ABS, and the underlying assets, namely the green loans, need to be consistent with the taxonomy. So these are just a few very straightforward usage of taxonomy, which essentially says that taxonomy provides a foundation for the functioning of the entire green financial system. The challenge globally is that there has been a proliferation of taxonomies. Back 6-7 years ago, when we were launching the G20 Green Finance Study Group, we were complaining about the lack of taxonomy in many jurisdictions, but now the situation is different. A large number of taxonomies popped up. I think about 20 countries or jurisdictions have published their own taxonomy. Some of them have more than one, and many associations, NGOs have developed their taxonomies, and many companies, financial institutions, asset managers, banks, they all have their own taxonomies, which leads to a problem that if these taxonomies are developed in silos, proliferation of such taxonomies may exacerbate problems such as market segmentation, increase the transaction costs, and the risk of greenwashing, and may undermine the effort to promote cross-border green capital flows. A specific example was between China and Europe. The Chinese taxonomies were different from European taxonomies, and therefore, for the Chinese issuers to issue a green bond in Europe, if it needs to be recognized both by Chinese investors and the European investors, the issuer will have to qualify both taxonomies in China and Europe, which certainly increase the transaction cost for the international issuance of such green finance products. So recognizing this problem, the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group in last year's Sustainable Finance Roadmap developed a few principles for alignment of approach for aligning investment activities against the Paris Agreement and other SDG objectives. And such alignment approach certainly includes taxonomy. And specifically, we said in the roadmap that these principles will aim to enhance compatibility, interoperability, and consistency of these approaches. Now, how do we enhance interoperability? These are the 6 specific principles which we stated as action 1 in the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap. The most important ones are number 1 and number 2. For example, principle 1 says that all the activities that you recognize as green or sustainable need to contribute positively to the SDGs, which really means that you have to contribute at least to one of these 17 SDGs, either reducing carbon or reducing air pollution, water pollution, land contamination, or protecting biodiversity and others. And principle 2 is also very important. We need to avoid negative contribution, namely the no harm principle against any other sustainability goals. For example, if you do a project which is positive for climate, namely reducing carbon, it should not be contributing to or negatively contributing to other objectives such as biodiversity, cutting trees and polluting waters and so on. So, all country jurisdictions follow these principles. I think their taxonomy will look in principle quite similar. That certainly increases the interoperability. And also the G20 roadmap proposed a couple more specific actions to improve coordination. In this paragraph under Action 2, it says jurisdictions that intend to pursue a taxonomy-based approach should consider developing taxonomies using the same language. For example, using International Standard Industrial Classification, ISIC, which is used by the Common Ground Taxonomy, or voluntary use of reference or common taxonomy. Of course, you can use a Common Ground Taxonomy as such a reference. And finally, regional collaboration on taxonomy development, which really refers to the efforts you are making in Latin America. In fact, in the G20 discussion, I specifically mentioned that the places like Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia and ASEAN might be suitable for a regional taxonomy rather than too many taxonomy for smaller economies and markets, so that it can enhance liquidity and the interoperability within the different parts of the region. A specific effort to enhance interoperability was the ITSF Working Group on Taxonomy. This ITSF was launched in October 2019 by European Union, China, and a dozen other jurisdictions. And now this network represents 55% of the greenhouse gas emission in the world and 50% of the global population. Under the ITSF, a working group was launched back 2 years ago, co-chaired by myself, representing PBOC, namely the Chinese Central Bank, and Marcel Hug, representing DG FISMA of European Commission. In the past 2 years, this working group has already produced the first version of the Common Ground Taxonomy, which is based on the Chinese taxonomy and European taxonomy. Basically, we take the overlapping portion of the two taxonomies, and the first version included 55 activities under climate mitigation, which are consistent with both the Chinese and the European taxonomies. So with such taxonomy, the Chinese issuers can issue bonds in the international market, especially for European investors with no difficulty, and vice versa. European issuers can issue green bonds in China using the same Common Ground Taxonomy. The specific works done by the IPS Working Group and Technical Expert Group are the following. They decided to develop a Common Ground Taxonomy, initially based on EU and Chinese taxonomy. Of course, in the future, we can expand the basis for comparison. And the second step is to map the two taxonomies into the same language, namely ISIC, International Standard Industrial Classification, so that the two taxonomy could be compared. The reason is that both taxonomy were written in using other classification, which were not comparable to start with. And that's why the working group spent a lot of time converting them into the same classification of same language. And in the first published version, which was out in November last year, the Common Ground Taxonomy included the 55 mitigation activities that was recognized both by China and Europe. For the methodology, these are some of the details. The first stage of the methodology work involved selecting these activities of EU Taxonomy Climate Delegate Act, because that was the only act officially approved in Europe. And then we extracted the climate mitigation activities from the Chinese taxonomy. China taxonomy includes more activity than just the climate mitigation. But this time we only focused on climate mitigation from both EU and China. Then we map them into the same language of classification, and then selecting the common activities from these two taxonomies with a fairly complex set of methodologies, because they belong to many different scenarios. a snapshot of the Common Ground Taxonomy table. It's only part of the outline. From the usage, these are four areas we can use the Common Ground Taxonomy. One is to compare different taxonomies. The Common Ground Taxonomy report actually provides a very detailed description of how we compare the Chinese and the European taxonomy under many different scenarios and picking the common portion of common activities. And secondly, for developing green finance products, in fact, it was already used by the Chinese issuer in December last year. The China Construction Bank, they issued the first green bond internationally, labeled against the Common Ground Taxonomy and sold to the international market, especially to European investors. And more recently, the China Industrial Bank issued a second international green bond labeled against the Common Ground Taxonomy. I'm looking for actually more, looking forward to more issuance like that, actually both from China and from Europe in the near future. Of course, green bonds are not the only products you can use the Common Ground Taxonomy for labeling purposes. You can label a package of assets, for example, green bond funds, green ABS, green infrastructure REITs, using the Common Ground Taxonomy. And the third usage is to serve as a reference for other jurisdictions to develop the taxonomy. In fact, Sri Lanka was the first country that developed a green finance taxonomy using Common Ground Taxonomy as the most important reference. And Hong Kong also stated that they will develop a taxonomy based on the Common Ground Taxonomy. And I think many other jurisdictions are looking into the Common Ground Taxonomy as an important building block or reference. And finally, in terms of developing interoperability globally among the taxonomies, I think the Common Ground Taxonomy could serve as an important basis to develop what I call a building block approach to promote the harmonization of global taxonomy. In this case, the Common Ground Taxonomy can serve as a baseline building block. And based on this building block, any jurisdictions can add other blocks which reflect their domestic policy priorities and local circumstances. For example, Hong Kong is certainly thinking about that. Common Ground Taxonomy could become the major part of its taxonomy, but Hong Kong has its own peculiarity in terms of green building and retrofitting. So they want to add something related to the building sector in their own taxonomy. And other jurisdictions may add transition activities which are helping carbon-intensive sectors to move towards net zero, in addition to the Common Ground Taxonomy, which is close to pure green activities. There are a lot of positive reactions in the past few months. Once we issued the first version of the Common Ground Taxonomy, these are the 20 feedbacks which we received from different organizations. And based on these feedbacks, we are actually refining the Common Ground Taxonomy, and it's about to issue the second version. I think it will be coming out in the coming few weeks. And the second version will include more than 70 activities. On top of the 55, we have now more manufacturing-related activities, as well as building-related activities in the second version of the Common Ground Taxonomy report. And going forward, we'll also look to increase the number of objectives in the Common Ground Taxonomy. As I said earlier, so far, the Common Ground Taxonomy only focused on climate mitigation, but in the future, we will cover environment, circular economy, biodiversity, and so on, once these are ready from the EU taxonomy. And we're also looking to expand the basis for comparison. Currently, it's only China and Europe as the basis for Common Ground Taxonomy. In the future, there could be more jurisdictions joining this comparison base. And of course, the long-term goal is to promote interoperability of the global standards for sustainable finance, especially taxonomy. And we're looking forward to more inputs from various parts of the global small finance markets on how to enhance interoperability and contributing to global green capital flows cross-border. Let me stop here and thanks again for the invitation, and I wish the conference today a great success. Thank you.